Hello. Once again, we're meeting virtually, and I'm just about getting to the point where this seems normal. I'm Jim Thomason, and I've been with CMS as a purchasing agent since 2005. Way back then, it was the Ed Center. It was uptown, and we're near the First Baptist Church. 3 moves later, we settled into what may be our permanent home on South Andrew Boulevard. Well, things are going smooth, then boom, COVID hits, another change. They give the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus credit for the saying, "The only constant in life is change." I may argue his point of exclusivity, but it's definitely a large part of our existence. As I understand, Rebecca has already announced that transition to a new ERP system is almost dawning. In light of that, I'll try my darndest to focus most of this presentation on things that will remain the same as we venture forward. If you're new to this role, give me a shout and I'll email you last year's presentation, which speaks in a greater concentration to our current loss in ERP system. Look at the screen. I bet many of you have a printed copy of the Who Buys What list somewhere near your computer. Go ahead and grab it and look at the first page. I'll give you a second. Does Ted Davis's name appear on the list? Though I still think of Ted often, he's no longer processing POs. He's been retired since February 2018. Do the commodity assignments look like those on the list on the screen? If not, it's older than the June 2018 revision, and it's time to either print a copy of the new one, or better yet, bookmark this one on your browser. It's available by going to the public internet site, clicking on Departments, N through P, Procurement Services, and then in the left margin, click on Who Buys What. Let's look at some of my assigned categories. Okay, how many of you created requisitions for POs for field trips last year? Me either. From the announcement July 15th by Deputy Superintendent Matt Hayes, it looks like they may be on again, with COVID precautions, of course. Looking at the screen, I'm sure you're very familiar with many of the locations, but there may be a few your school may not be attending. Perhaps you could jot down a few for your teachers as possible field trip ideas for this school year. It seems that each of these vendors has its own rules as to whether they charge tax on admission or not. The North Carolina Department of Revenue says that those they consider entertainment, such as plays, cinema, spectator sports, and museum admission, are taxable. Some locations consider themselves purely educational, even some museums, and as a result, they don't charge tax on admission. Just an FYI, those so-called in-house field trips, they're not taxed. I seem to be constantly updating a short list I keep of who taxes and who doesn't. Although it's by no means comprehensive, I'm happy to share the list. Just shoot me an email. CMS has saved tons of money on lodging, travel, expenses, and the extra cost of conferences and trainings since they went virtual during the pandemic. I'm already seeing hybrid in-person/virtual events scheduled for this year, as well as strictly in-person events. We may not see these savings going forward. I've not heard a decision on proms and dances yet, but barring a resurgence of COVID, hopefully these can return. There's also no word on flights yet, but if the door opens, the district's go-to source for domestic airline arrangements is AAA. Pam Harrell in Accounts Payable has a procedure sheet for buying airline tickets. If and when you need this information, shoot me an email and I can share it. CAT's bus tickets for student transportation are also on my list. And changing gears to transportation for field trips, I wonder how many of your students have ever ridden on a passenger train. Amtrak has been used for a few field trips. The tickets must be paid for at the time of purchase by school check, or you can contact Accounts Payable about the possibility of using a check request. If not using Fund 11, that is. Charter buses usually require payment either before the trip, at the time of the trip, or immediately upon return to the school. If unable to pay at that time, prior arrangements must be made with the vendor and/or Accounts Payable. All tour companies, most of these using charter buses that I've dealt with, require payments several weeks, if not months, in advance of the trip. The district can only use charter buses from the CMS approved charter bus list, and the CMS Transportation Department administers the charter bus approval process. As of July 21st, they are still working on getting contracts and approvals in place for the new school year. By the way, all transportation and conference purchases are non-taxable. I started my work career in the restaurant business, and it's obvious I love food, love to eat. For those reasons, I sometimes wonder if I was typecast in the role of food buyer. Well, whatever. As those of you know who've been here a while, Food Lion is the only grocery store that allows us to use a purchase order to charge and pay later for items available at their store. If you were spending school funds and can write a check, most any grocery store will accept our school check. Tax rates for prepared foods, such as Food Lion Deli, and the restaurant purchases are taxed at 8.25%. Since Lawson does not encumber tax until the PO is issued, make sure you have enough funding to pay for the purchase with 8.25% tax. Lawson doesn't give the requisitioner the ability to tax at any rate other than 7.25%. If you're not using an LPO for payment, I'll be glad to change the tax rate for you before I issue the PO. I can correct the tax rate as well. So since off-the-shelf food items are taxed at 2% and your PO is taxed at 7.25%, you must have leftover money on your PO. Just an FYI, the North Carolina Department of Revenue must not consider candy or soft drinks as food. Those two items are taxed at 7.25%. I'm also the buyer for concessions equipment, purchase or rental. Popcorn and cotton candy machines are popular. I've even had one school buy a cheese warmer for nachos. I need to find out where that's at. And don't forget, everyone likes snow cones and shaved ice. Most schools eventually need that flag out front replaced. I've had a few schools that seem to be competing with the United Nations in the number of flags displayed. If you're one of them and need help finding a flag for Burkina Faso or Cote d'Ivoire, I have a list of one local and multiple other vendors that sell flags, and I'll be glad to share. Though my main customer is CMS Transportation, I do have a few high school CTE automotive departments that buy tires and auto parts. I'm also the buyer if you ever find the need to issue a PO for diesel, gasoline, or propane fuel for your fleet. When the CTE Culinary Arts Program or our cafeterias need food equipment or small wares, I also buy that. Any paper, plastic, cleaning supplies used by cafeterias, and of course, food are on my list. Oh, almost forgot. Before I go, although I said I didn't want to focus on Lawson, and I have, I'm sure, I do need to mention one more thing about it. In previous years, Budget Department has mentioned to use soft dollar methods for purchasing services. In other words, putting the dollar amount in the quantity field, making the unit of measure the dollar symbol, and showing the cost as the number one. Procurement has been assertive that goods purchases must be itemized. The requisition for shipping and freight charges is an exception. Since we frequently have to change it on the purchase order for accounts payable, I want to remind you that to use the soft dollar method on the freight or shipping charges line on goods purchases. This allows accounts payable to receive the exact shipping charges for each shipment and leaves the remaining to be used against future shipments. Well, if it looks like we're going virtual next year, I need to get with Amy Shire, our audiovisual buyer, to purchase a teleprompter to save me from looking at the papers the entire time. In closing, I do want to thank each one of you for taking the time for viewing our presentations and hope to see you in person soon. I pray that you have a great school year.